This is a more detailed look at planning schemes. So if you're really new to planning, hopefully the overview has got you comfortable with going in and opening one of the schemes. I tend to use Hobart Interim Planning Scheme and learning to start opening and closing pages and figuring out what's there. So this is a little bit more of a detailed look at the controls and how to move around. So you've seen this. The first thing that you're doing when you're thinking about a development from a planning perspective, so you might be working for the developer, you might be a planner working in council, is the activity exempt? So is it beekeeping? There's a bunch of things that just don't need to be considered. So there's a whole lot of activities, whole classes of activities where there are exemptions within the Land Use Planning Act. So these are some of them: forestry, a contentious but classic one, mineral exploration, fish and marine farming, existing use rights. So you might have something that doesn't actually fit within the planning scheme, and you might want to, for example, our neighbours at the moment are fixing up a heritage porch. They don't need to apply for planning to do those works because the porch is there, it's too close to the street, but too bad because it's already there. They're just fixing it up, no planning permit required. So there's a few quirks here, either within LUPA or, in the case of the bottom part of this screen, or in other acts that allow works to happen where you might normally expect planning permission to be needed. Don't worry about the details. It's just to alert you to the fact that you don't want to dive right in immediately into the guts of the planning scheme, just in case you've got one of those slightly odd examples where either it's exempt or it's this whole different pathway. So I'm going to try now to make sure that I pull out bits of the scheme, because this is all a little bit theoretical until you get used to actually working in a scheme and opening and closing and scrolling down things and actually reading the words. So the practice of moving around the scheme is what you need to get used to. So this is what the relevant part of the scheme actually looks like when it comes to these activities. So you can see that it says nothing in a planning scheme or the Tasmanian Planning Scheme affects forestry operations because they're dealt with under the Forest Practices Act, mineral exploration because Mineral Resources Development Act covers that, fishing, marine farming. So this is important to know, and where if you're new, you need guidance from somebody who does know, that you don't start assessing an application for forestry operations because it's a whole different thing. And early on, it's also important to figure out whether the use either doesn't require a permit, it's exempt from a permit, it's a permitted use, discretion use, prohibited use. So if you're in a zone that's for residential and you're looking at a work that's, say, an abattoir, it's going to be prohibited. So this is where there's just these checks that go on initially to make sure that you're heading in the right direction. So the discretionary use is where most of our work as planners comes in, because it's not an automatic, yes, your house completely fits in with what is acceptable and you will get a permit. It's not that it doesn't require a permit, it's not that it's prohibited, it's this other grey area where some interpretation and some expertise and some conversation is required. So this is what the relevant part of the planning scheme looks like. And I know this text is very small, but this is Hobart Interim Planning Scheme, Part D under zones, under in a residential zone. I'm using this because we're looking specifically at 22 Waterloo Crescent at the moment. And so this is the relevant use table in that zone. So in that zone, no permit is required if you're looking at home-based childcare in accordance with a licence under the Childcare Act. You don't need to bother council with asking for a planning permit if that's the use that you're looking at. If you skip further down to permitted, I know this will be hard to see, but I'll talk you through what it says. If it's residential, except for home-based businesses, well, this is interesting in the current environment, except if home-based business with more than one non-resident worker employee, more than one 30-metre squared area. So if you're very small and really you're just working from home, fine. But if you're looking at something that's a bit bigger, that actually somebody is coming to your house to work, it might be a discretionary use. So discretionary, and I've cut it off here. I've just got the first use class, which is business and professional services. So suffice to say, let's not get lost in the detail. It's figuring out which zone, what use, how does this fit? And every use has to be classified. So there's all of these different uses. And if your use doesn't quite fit, you have to make it fit. It has to fit. You can't make up a new use. It has to fit one of the existing uses. So every use, proposed use or development must be categorizing into one of the existing classes. Subservient uses, like maybe a shed that's part of a bigger development, a subservient use is in the same use class. If the use or development actually fits into more than one use class, pick the one that best applies. If it doesn't readily fit, pick one. And if you actually have more than one class, you might actually need to use, each must be individually categorized into different use. Okay, lots of words on this slide, but the important thing to note is here, you have to come up with a use, or in some cases, more than one use that fits into the use tables. So choose a use class is a really important stage of deciding how your development is, or how your use is going to fit into the planning scheme. So you need to go down and look at these, and these are hyperlinked to definitions, and see what they say. Sometimes there's qualifications, sometimes there isn't. So again, have a look in the planning scheme, go back, and maybe actually while you're listening to this, have, for example, Hobart Interim Planning Scheme, which is where all these screenshots come from, have it open and shut these pages so that you can see what I'm talking about and you can see the full extent of it, and you can scroll up and down. So under Part B administration, this is where there are some exemptions. So again, it's about being aware of these and not just diving straight in and thinking through how the development meets the planning scheme, because maybe it's completely exempt. And part of what I like here is right up the top of the exemptions is beekeeping, which is kind of sweet. Bees are very important. We all know that bees are having a tough time. So if you are using the land for beekeeping, that's exempt. You don't need a planning permit. So I do encourage you to have a look around some of these. The next section after section 5 is section 6, limited exemptions. Again, you know, most often places where you'd come across this is vegetation clearing or planting or modification, fencing. A lot of times if you're building something completely standard, unless you're in a heritage zone where controlling is very tight over streetscape, then if you're just doing something standard, it'll be pretty minimal. But if you're wanting to build a really high fence, something out of the ordinary for the neighbourhood outside these limited exemptions, then you might need a planning permit. Again, it's just a matter of getting used to opening and shutting things and figuring out whether your specific development that you're thinking of or that you're assessing fits these definitions or not. Again, before we get down into zones and codes, under part C, so moving from part B to part C, there are some special provisions. So yeah, some of this is about subdivisions, demolition, adjusting boundaries. I've got to that particular place under this part where the highlighted bit on the right here is about adjustment for the boundaries. Under certain circumstances, your use might be permitted. So if you're not actually making any additional lots and it's just a really minor change, and yeah, you're basically not really changing anything in that adjustment, then you might not need to go through the whole rigmarole of getting a planning permit. So just some important checks to be aware of. Zones, as you have already got the gist of, are incredibly important. Most are just standard zones now that we have the Tasmanian planning scheme kind of partway in place. And zones are great. As a geographer, we love zones because they're mapped and they're on a map and you can explore them and you know where you are because they're quite specific. So have a look. This is just a text copied from a planning scheme. Each zone looks like this, where it has a purpose statement, objectives. It doesn't always, not all zones have all these for all schemes. So each council works with these to fill them out as is appropriate. And this is the work that gets done with the Tasmanian Planning Commission before an interim scheme becomes a final Tasmanian planning scheme. So this probably doesn't mean very much until you start going into a particular zone and opening things. So these are the zones. So we did talk about the environmental management zone a bit with respect to Lake Malbina. You'll get used to looking at the details under inner residential when it comes to Battery Point. And you will look at changing the zone in the case of Geilston Bay, your final assignment in 2021, where we're changing from an environmental living zone, I think, to, don't quote me on this, I think to general residential. Bunfrey's driving that part of the unit. But this, yeah, zones will come up in a big way at the end of semester. So when you get into the detail, for example, in a residential zone, and you know what your use is, and then you start working through all the detail, you come across lots and lots of tables that have these two different parts to them: acceptable solutions and performance criteria. And you basically need to work out whether what you're looking at, and this really only does kind of come to life when you're actually working through an example, does it fit what has decided as acceptable for that zone? So in this, I think this is from general residential rather than inner. This particular part of it is that the hours of operation, I can't remember where this is coming from, I should have copied a bit more detail. If your hours of operation are between 8 and 6, it's fine. If they're not, then you need to show these other things. And I've got this picture of this bloke standing here with his trucks, because this can be about vehicle movements in the case of a commercial operation, which has opening hours. So the keywords here is must not have an unreasonable impact on residential amenity. So if you are, for example, running some kind of an office supply and you're having cars coming and going a lot, then there needs to be agreement about what's okay under that performance criteria if there's going to be activity outside 8 to 6. Don't worry about the detail. It's just to get the gist of looking at what's acceptable and what is sitting outside what's acceptable, and therefore you have to look at the wording and agree on what's reasonable. So on the left-hand side, under what are acceptable solutions, you'll see a bunch of numbers. And so in this particular case, where we're talking about a garage or a carport, I've actually got a house in the picture rather than a garage and a carport, but never mind. It must have a distance, a setback from the primary frontage of the property that meets these criteria. If it doesn't, then it must have a setback that is compatible with others in the street. And so this is where the developer or the planner will have a look around, go on site, it's what we'll be doing in Battery Point, and look at what is typical and try to fit in with what is typical. And you can see there's qualification here, taking into account any topographical constraints, because maybe it's super steep and you just can't do what is typical, but this is where the conversation is important and some agreement is reached and is written into the permit and the conditions on the permit. So zones and zone details, all important. The other and really important control, and you hopefully have got the gist of this by now, just with the few examples that we've already worked through, codes, or we call them overlays as well, they're not necessarily spatially defined on a map. Maybe in the case of flood zones, landslip zones, they are, but maybe in the case of bushfire, they're not. It just really depends. It might be defined by something else. Sometimes there can be a clash between codes and zones, and if there is, where they're inconsistent, the codes override the zones. So again, I know there's lots of words on this page, but it's a matter of having the planning scheme open and having a look around. So this is my favourite code, biodiversity code, taken from the Hobart Interim Planning Scheme. So if you're actually in the planning scheme, go down to code, open it up, you'll see all the different codes, go to the biodiversity code, you should see this here. And so this gives you the purpose. So as we looked at environmental management last week with respect to Lake Malbina, this is the purpose statements here. So the purpose of this provision is to minimise the loss of threatened native vegetation, is to conserve identified threatened fauna, minimise the loss of other biodiversity values that are recognised as locally significant. Unfortunately, this does mean that a lot of clearing can take place because it doesn't actually fit this. And there is a bit of debate going on at the moment about whether we're adequately looking after biodiversity in this change to the statewide planning scheme. So yeah, biodiversity code is one of many. There are a bunch that are pretty much always triggered, parking and access, stormwater, a bunch that are probably pretty rarely triggered, acid, sulfate, soils, dispersive soils, but they're important because when they do apply, you need to take really good notice of them. All right, so keep going down and open up part F, and you can see that at least for the Hobart Interim Planning Scheme, this is what you see. So depending on the planning scheme, there might be some specific area plans. Gregory Street seems a little odd to me to have isolated that. It's an area in Sydney Bay that has a bunch of businesses along it. Anyway, it has a specific area plan. North Hobart specific area plan. Wellington Park is a whole different kind of kettle of fish that has its own act, but anyway, it has its own specific area plan, and the Hobart Hospital Hilly Patio Space has a specific area plan. So most of the time you won't need to know about all of these odd conditions, but just in terms of the purposes of today and opening and closing the planning scheme and working your way down, just have a quick look. Okay, last slide. A whole lot of words. Again, it's just a matter of opening the appendix and probably closing it really quickly because you generally won't need to know this. It is just a kind of a legalese at the end here that says sometimes there might be other documents that are important, that are clear and readily accessible, that are kind of part of the legal status of the planning scheme, because they're referenced here. So I wouldn't worry too much, except to say that, yeah, that sometimes documents are given weight because they're referred to in appendices. Okay, so I hope that hasn't been too overwhelming, and that you feel a little bit more comfortable with opening up the relevant planning scheme, opening and closing things to find your way around.